grab your cuppa. It's time for the Inclusivity Podcast, spilling the tea on disability inclusivity. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Inclusivity. I'm your host Jamie, and here today we are going to spill the tea with a fantastic guest. Now I say guest, but this is an absolute extraordinaire. It is our sponsor. It is someone who gave us hope when we were starting off the podcast, and that is Diverse Educators, specifically the CEO, founder, entrepreneur, the legend that is Hannah. Hannah, before I pass over to you, I'm going to do a visual description of myself. I am Jamie. I have dark short hair, quiff to one side. You know what to say, the higher the hair, the closer to God. I have blue eyes and a short dark beard. And today I'm wearing a green jumper and I'm holding my branded inclusivity mug. So Hannah, come say hello and introduce yourself to everybody.
Good morning, Jamie. Good morning, listeners. It's fantastic to be here. My name is Hannah Wilson, and as Jamie said, I'm the co-founder and director of Diverse Educators. What do I look like? Well, I'm 6'1". You can't see that when I'm sat down, but I'm very tall. I have got reddish albany hair to my shoulders. I am wearing my glasses because my eyesight has begun to go in the last few years. I have got a sprinkling of freckles, and today I am wearing a black top with blue dots on it.
Fabulous. Hannah, it is so exciting to have you here because we had a chat, I think it was a few months ago initially we had a chat, and just listeners, just to let you know, it was a complete rabbit hole after rabbit hole. Me and Hannah had a phone call around the podcast and sponsoring the podcast, but I think we laughed more in that call. I think I laughed more in that half an hour than I did all week, and it was just full of energy, and I knew at that moment, if Diverse Educators or if Hannah's willing to sponsor us, this is going to be an absolutely amazing friendship / partnership, and it has been. So Hannah, firstly, thank you so much. Without you, this wouldn't all be possible.
Absolute pleasure. Well, I remember meeting you or seeing the snowflake that became an avalanche over that weekend on LinkedIn, where you shared some infographics around accessibility, and I think you were quite taken by surprise how much traction you got and how many comments and how many likes. And I think you realised at that point you needed to put your name and your branding on it because it started being shared on all social media and people weren't giving you the credit. And I was being your little gatekeeper, tagging you in, saying, "Jamie made it. It's Jamie." He's like, "Can we please sort of like amplify the person whose ideas it was?"
It was for me. It was the moment that I think I realised that, oh my goodness, I actually have what I put in LinkedIn has impact, and it creates conversation. And for anyone who doesn't, who isn't aware of this graphic, I showed a graphic around inclusion and diversity and equity and equality, all those kind of, I hate to call them buzzwords, but those kind of words that we see so prominently in the space of diversity and inclusion. And I kind of put it into context of how you get shoes, and each one had its own little meaning, and it was from a book I read, but it just completely blew up. And I think the best thing that's came from that has been our friendship, Hannah, so it has. So here we are today. But for anyone who doesn't know, who is Diverse Educators? What do you do? For me, initially when I came across it, I was like, oh, I'm not sure of this. But again, it's because I don't work in education. So do you want to tell our listeners who you are, what you do?
For the people who aren't educated or aren't educated in the UK, we started as part of the grassroots kind of movement. So in education, we don't always get the answers and the solutions we want and we need from the system. So over the last sort of 10 years, there's been a lot of activity and a lot of energy in the grassroots scene on educational Twitter, teach meets where people come together in pubs or at weekends to share ideas. And I was involved in all of that through Twitter. And then 8 years ago, a conversation started around gender equality or gender inequality within the education system, because we are a female-heavy profession and we don't always get visibility as female leaders. And I just joined a conversation, and the next thing I know, we were starting Women Ed. So Women Ed is kind of the big sister of Diverse Ed, and that's a now global gender equality network for people who identify as being women in education. A year later, BAME Ed launched, and that's an affinity group for people of colour, and they've now got charity status. A year later, LGBT Ed launched, and a year later, Disability Ed. So there's these four big networks, grassroots networks, virtual networks, where you can connect if you identify with your lived experience or if you are an ally. As a head teacher, at this point, 5 years ago, I was a head teacher, and I was on duty one morning with my deputy head, Benny Carver, and we were chatting about like what events we'd be going to that month. We'd met through Women Ed. We both went to quite a few of these events. And she said very candidly and very tongue in cheek with me, if only I could just go to one event like you, because I only have to go to Women Ed because I'm white, I'm straight, and I'm able bodied. And she said, I've got to go to 4 events this month. This Saturday, I'm going to be a woman. Next Saturday, I'm brown. The Saturday after, I'm gay. And now I've got a hearing aid. I need to go to disability ed. And we had this kind of very open conversation about the fact that she had to cut herself in 4, and there wasn't a space to go to where she could bring her whole self. So I went away and thought about it and came back to her a few days later and just made the suggestion that we had this big, beautiful, brand new school in Oxfordshire. Why don't we invite all of our network from those 4 spaces to come together under one roof for a joined up conversation to make things a bit more coherent, a bit more cohesive? So 5 Januaries ago, 250 people came to us on a Saturday, and we launched this beautiful space, this beautiful network, where we think about people as being whole people, and we think about how to join up the dots in this work and to create that kind of that synergy, that it's not a single issue approach. It's about us thinking about belonging and representation and identity for all. And 5 years on, I've left headship. I now do this work full-time independently, and we've got a team of associate consultant trainers and coaches who support schools on thinking about how can they lean into DEI work in a more strategic, more sustainable and more meaningful way.
Absolutely incredible. And I think, for me, that intersectional piece is when people ask what's wrong with the space of diversity and inclusion, it's that intersectional piece, because you're quite right. People are having to wear one hat and then the next day put on a different hat, and it's almost like you almost be afraid to speak about something in a certain space because the space hasn't been set up that way. Was really and truly, we should be creating spaces that are intersectional, where people can bring different parts of their identity, because it's what makes it makes up who we are. It's not just I'm disabled today, that's it, don't think about anything else. My gay hat's at the door, my neurodivergent hat's at the computer. It doesn't work that way. We're all intersectional, diverse beings. And for me, then within education, I went to specialist education when I was younger, and I think that diversity, equity, inclusion was always something I think wasn't in the syllabus the way it should have always been. And I think then, from your perspective, Hannah, is that something that you recognise and kind of also shape this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a conversation that's been long overdue. And I think the conversations have really started in the last 3 to 4 years, significantly because of George Floyd's murder. And I think that was a real turning point, a milestone in the school system. Well, society waking up, but the school system waking up as well. So a lot of schools have lent into anti racist work in the last 3 years. But I think when you start picking up stones and looking underneath them to think about how inclusive are we as a school, you realise that other identity groups also aren't being included and haven't got a high level of belonging. And I think disability is a really interesting one because it's one of the ones that impacts a lot of people. Like 1 in 5 people in UK society have got a disability. And as you know, often those disabilities are invisible or hidden and we don't know about them. And coming from schools where we are so data rich when it comes to the children, like I could literally tell you in any class I was teaching or any school I was leading in, the percentage of children who had an additional need, what their additional needs were, what we were doing to close those additional needs. It's not the same for the staff, Jamie. A lot of the time we don't know the additional needs of the staff, and thereby the reasonable adjustments aren't being made to support the staff, the adults within the system. And I think that's a really interesting gap that really needs closing. And a lot of schools come to us and say, can we do the DEI work? And they want to do it for the children. And we're like, you need to do it for everybody. It needs to be for all stakeholders within your school community.
And I think it's so important that if you're a teacher or if you're an educator and you haven't got the support yourself to do the job, but you're almost making sure that children who maybe do already have adjustments in place, that must be a really kind of bittersweet pill to swallow, because it's almost that you are creating an inclusive, accessible environment for that child, but you yourself are going home and probably a little bit frustrated at the end of each day that your needs aren't being met. And I think, what you said there about disability, you're quite right, 1 in 5 is disabled, and 80% of us acquire disability in our lifetime. So the potential is that, for 80% of us, we're going to acquire disability in our lifetime. And it's only when people acquire disability that they take action. And I think this conversation that you're having is so important, because we need our educators to be able to practice what they're preaching as well. Do you know what I mean? They need to live that. And I wonder then, Hannah, in the time that you have been building out, because you do a lot of different workshops right across the world. For anyone who doesn't know, Hannah, when we message, Hannah, you do a lot of meetings and you're so busy. And I wonder if can you shine a light on what motivates you? What fuels you? Is it this that we need this conversation, or does it change that motivation?
It's a really good question. So I get asked a lot about like what's my driver, and I think it's advocacy, and I think it's justice, and I think early on I've always been a big reader, so literature's always been a real love of mine, and I was quite critical of what I studied at GCSE and A level. I was basically studying all the dead white guys, and I didn't want to do a degree for 3 years reading more of the dead white guys. So I found a degree that was post-colonial literature that was going to give me a different lens on looking at books and stories and human narratives. And I think that then really shaped me as an English teacher, really thinking about representation within the curriculum. I've worked in really, really diverse schools, like visually diverse schools in South London, where we've had a high percentage of different faiths represented, different races represented, and a lot of different disabilities and additional needs. So I guess that then really made me think about like, who am I as a teacher? Who am I teaching? How am I teaching them? What am I teaching them? And I became quite critical, particularly around the lack of racial representation in the leadership matter. So I guess it's been like you talk about rabbit holes. I do say that you dive down a rabbit hole. It's like Alice in Wonderland, isn't it? And you end up going in all different directions. And I always say to people when I'm training them, you don't know what you don't know until you start looking, and you realise how little you know and how much unlearning, relearning we need to then do to understand more. And I've learnt more about diversity, equity, inclusion in the last 3 years since leaving working in schools for 20 years. And I think that's sacrilege. Like, I think that's absolutely not right that now I've got the time and the headspace to read and to learn and to go to training. I'm a better version of who I was as an educator. And if only I was now working in a school. So I see myself as someone who can help others accelerate that journey. And in the UK, we've got 27,000 state schools. Rather than 27,000 schools all trying to do this work individually, how can we be as efficient and as effective as possible? So we host big events. We host a lot of free virtual events. We do paid for training as well, programs and workshops. But we just try to make the resources as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. And we sponsor and commission and curate a number of different things, such as our toolkits. So we've got 28 thematic toolkits. So when people do come to our events or come to our training and realise they've got these big gaps and holes they want to plug, rather than them spending an hour trying to find what to read, here's our toolkit, go and read it and begin to do that upskill. So I guess that's how I position myself as an ally, as an advocate, as a champion for this work. But I've always had a background in training and teacher and leadership development. So I guess I bring that strategic kind of lens to it about how can we do this at scale? How can we have impact? How can we make sure that we're making a difference for the children in front of us in our schools?
Absolutely brilliant. And like I kind of made a joke there, said you're so busy, Hannah, and I think it's just a testament to how much this is needed. You know, I think about my experiences in education, and I think about being in special school, and even saying special school, I sometimes cringe at that because I'm like, I wasn't special. It was just my needs were I had accessible needs, and I think that's something that I always kind of struggle with. And I want to talk to you maybe about, you know, what is your view in this term special needs? You know, is that something you feel that we should be focused on, or is that something that you'd like to see us move away from, or what's your views on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We've got an interesting school system, haven't we, where we segregate children based on their needs. And like I've done a lot of work in mainstream schools, but when I was training to teach, I did a placement in a special school. And when I was doing my leadership qualification for a head teacher, they call it the MPQH over here in England, there were 68 of us in our programme. And I can remember a head of an alternative provision school asking the room, how many of you have visited a special school or an alternative provision school? And there was a very, very small proportion of people in the room who had actually been to those alternative provisions. But all of those mainstream leaders were sending children quite willingly to them, and they didn't really know where they were sending them. So I think that's something to really think about how we can increase the knowledge and the awareness of mainstream educators and leaders about what it is to send a child to a special school or an alternative provision school. One of the events I'm involved in January is actually called Include Ed. And Include Ed is a grassroots annual conference all about how we can be more inclusive within the education system. And it's organised by a charity called The Difference, where they train up educators to go and spend 2 years in a special school or in alternative provision to understand more about those contexts and provision, to bring it back to a mainstream school, to share the expertise and the knowledge in that space. So there are some interesting things happening, but I do think we need to think about, when we talk about, oh, we're an inclusive school, but we send our children with additional needs to a different school, I think there's an interesting hypocrisy or dichotomy there for us to really unpick and to really analyse about, like, how inclusive are we if we're segregating.
I 100% agree. I think for myself, it's, you know, that expression, the pot calling the kettle black. It's, I think of that expression when, especially when it is, you know, schools claim to be inclusive, but segregating those children. And I think that's something that I experienced. You know, when I went to mainstream school, I also went to special school, but I went to mainstream school, I segregated most of it. And now when I think back on it, I just think that there was no provisions in place for the educators, and I don't blame the teachers. I don't blame the schools. It's just was always was happening before them, and it was that pattern. And I think when I look at what you're doing, Hannah, I see that pattern. I see a potential for that pattern to break, because again, it goes back to that whole intersectional piece. Is, you know, we should be setting up our classrooms for success. We should be empowering our teachers, making sure they have everything they need and they have the resources, but also set up a classroom so that they can be intersectional. That, you know, if there is a child who does have those additional needs or who needs some adjustments, that we're not automatically going to put them into a spare room and say, yeah, you stay in here, the class is going to do this, you're going to do something completely different, because you're not actually developing that person either.
No, absolutely. And if I can come back to the busyness bit, because I am busy, but I think everyone's busy. And I think busy's got, like, it's quite a loaded word, isn't it? There's quite a negative connotation about busy, that I am nothing like as busy as I was when I was a head teacher or school leader, thinking about my job 24/7, 365. And DEI back then was probably like 10% of my capacity. I was doing it in evenings and weekends. It's where my heart's at. It was my passion and my purpose. And by now doing this work fully 100%, it means that I can perhaps accelerate my own thinking and learning and understanding quicker, because it's my 100% now rather than my 10%. But I think just to build on that with this idea of schools becoming more inclusive, there's so little time in schools. Educators have so little time and so little energy. And I always say in my training, I always feel for the Senko. I always feel the person who is responsible for all the children in the school with additional needs. They probably get like 45 minutes max on the first day in September to update the whole school, all staff, on all additional needs within the building. And then you get reams of paper you're supposed to then read around all these additional needs and all these things you're supposed to be doing as a teacher. And it's really, really overwhelming. And you quite often only get like the headlines about all of these children's additional needs. And like I've said, like I've learned more about disability and additional needs since leaving, because I've got more time to actually go to training and think about it. And I just think, isn't that just ironic that we haven't got the time to really think about how inclusive we're being?
And I think that you know, it's at the moment I think about, you know, education, and even when I think about accessibility, that's, you know, if we are studying to do marketing, if we're studying to do web design, if we're studying to do teaching, you know, does accessibility get taught in teaching? Because I know it doesn't get taught in marketing, it doesn't get taught in web design. And for me, I'm like, if we were setting people up from that stage, they would have that little bit more knowledge from the get-go. But you're right, it's a constant learning journey. I have lived experience of disability, but I'm only an expert in my own lived experiences. I'm not an expert in my own condition, because I have not went and studied a degree in it. You know, there's so much more than my condition. I only know how it impacts me and my lived experiences. And I think that's so important what you're saying there, is by trying to find that time and kind of constantly being in that journey. And I think that, you know, for me, do you think, well, the question I'm going to ask you then is, do you think that maybe it's our education boards or government boards or the kind of departments who kind of work out those budgets and structures, do you think there's more that they could potentially be doing here to kind of help that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think accessibility is a really interesting one for us to think about within the context of the last few years, where our lives were flipped to being virtual and remote, and people have been in survival mode, but perhaps didn't think about how to make those spaces like online teaching, online training, as inclusive and as accessible as possible. And it's definitely been a steep learning journey for me as well. That thinking about running a DEI training business, and then I paid someone to do a consultation on my website. How accessible and inclusive is our website? And I got Richard and I, who you know, who edits this podcast, got a 24-page document of all the things that were wrong with our website and all the things we could be doing and should be doing. So thinking about how we put accessibility at the heart of a design process, that when we're designing a new program or a new event or a new space or a new website, whatever it might be, the accessibility needs to be central to that thinking, as opposed to a bolt-on at the end. Because you like, if we think about events for a second, quite often events are curated, a couple of speakers go out on a flyer, people start buying tickets, and then they realise they're not representative, and then they think they're not inclusive, and then they realise it's not accessible. And we've seen some real like flaws happen in the last few years where you're organising the climate justice conference for the world, and the person with a wheelchair can't even get into the building, but you're saying that disability is one of your priorities. I think it quite often isn't given the centrality or the significance at the start of the conversation.
It's almost the follow up, isn't it? The conversation. It's that added tick box that you made this accessible tick tick tick, and it's like, well, actually, if you get that accessibility piece right from the get go, you're actually going to be able to engage and interact with a lot more people, and you're going to be able to capture people who historically has been able to engage, participate, or even comment who haven't been able to. So you're actually going to get probably a lot more being said because by people who haven't been able to engage before. And I think for me, accessibility and design is something that I preach so much. So it is. I talk about content accessibility. I talk about accessibility to the workplaces, and for me, you're right. It comes down to that website, and the money, well, not even money, but studies show it costs more to fix a website down the line than it does right from the get go, and it's quite new, and it can be quite intimidating for somebody who's never encountered it before, especially website accessibility. I can remember I obviously use a screen reader, so I'll be online. I'll use my screen reader. If anybody's listening, screen reader is assistive technology that basically allows me to use a computer. It will speak back to me. If I highlight things, it'll read it back to me, but it'll also dictate when I'm talking to it. So it'll copy what I'm writing. I'll copy what I'm saying, sorry. But with me, I didn't have a clue what is an accessible website, what actually makes that accessible. I knew what I needed, but I wasn't sure the kind of terminology. And when I started learning about accessibility of a website, it is honestly it can take you down rabbit holes, but it can be very, very intimidating. So I think, to have that basic knowledge of accessibility is something that we all need to kind of have instilled in us. And I think that the sooner that we could do that, the better. One thing that I kind of am opting for, well, not opting for, is advocating for 2023 is to be working in education and kind of go around education and working with young people to kind of teach the basic accessibility from a young age. And when I say the basis is, we do IT. We all have those IT lessons. And, I don't know about anybody else, but I really don't remember much of my IT lessons. Like, really don't. I know how to turn the computer on, and I can get myself around to do a podcast, lucky enough. But again, thanks, Richard, for the editing. But, when it comes to the actual accessibility computer, I wasn't taught that. Despite going to a specialist education, I was never taught that. And I think, imagine if we could go back and teach young people how to write alt text in education in those IT classes, how to create something, thinking about colour contrast, how to use colour contrast checkers, how to kind of teach. Yes, we know everybody loves an emoji at your age, but you know what? If you use them sparingly and you add an image description here, you can actually start to engage people. I think the potential for what that could do in the future would be just phenomenal.
I think the children need it. I think the teachers need it more, Jamie, because it's the teachers who have the next class every year. And if this was built into initial teacher training, where not only are you being taught how to teach, but you're taught how to teach in an accessible way, and the accessible adaptive assistive technology is part of your understanding, so that you can then make sure that you are truly inclusive in what you do and what you say and how you do it, how you set your homework, all the different sort of like platforms you exist on as an educator. That could make such a massive difference. It really could.
100%. And I think that's the one thing, and I don't know about you, but it's one thing I see in the space a lot is the word inclusive. And I see that everywhere. It's like, we're inclusive, we're fully accessible. And then you go on, you realise within the first few minutes, actually, this isn't all singing, all dancing. And it's quite a deflating feeling, especially when you say, we're fully inclusive. But I want to tie back to something that you were saying about the pandemic. Obviously, that was quite a challenging time for everybody across the world, but particularly for educators who were suddenly having to move online, having to manage children and young adults in just different environments. But historically, you can turn your camera off; you have no clue what's going on in that room. So, for me, how did that impact your work, Hannah, and particularly and educators?
I left headship in 2019, and I spent a year working in a university and realised that wasn't the right role for me. So I resigned in January 2020, not knowing we were going into pandemic. So I was having plans around building my own business, doing consultancy, coaching, and training. And as I left in March, and I was due to go to Dubai for a conference, I couldn't go because literally that was the COVID cycling Italian drama at the hotel I was supposed to be staying at in Dubai, I did have a little moment of panic, like, what am I doing? I've had a salary, I've had a role for 20 years. Am I going to be able to earn a living for the indefinite future? But what happened was, because everything did flip to virtual, and because schools were so spread so thin and had so little capacity, I've got quite a big network from all the work I've done around DEI and women-led in particular. Schools started reaching out to me to say, could you help? So I've only worked virtually really in the last 3.5 years, which wasn't necessarily my plan. But by only working virtually, it means that my reach is much bigger. So in June 2020, George Floyd has been murdered. It was our virtual conference in June. 13,500 people joined us on a Saturday. Like, our events normally have 250 people in person, but because everyone was at home, because everyone was online, because the DEI was so in people's consciousness in that moment because of what was happening globally, and the conversation had been elevated, I think that was an interesting milestone for us. That was our 3rd year. We're getting into our 5th year, that suddenly we went to a different scale because people in other countries knew who we were and could access our events. And going back to accessibility, one of my ongoing battles is then time zones, because we're now doing work in UAE, we're doing work in Latin America, like thinking about what day we run our events on, because in Dubai they're at school on a Sunday and often a Friday, Saturday. So it's brought with it a whole new audience and a whole new appetite and energy, but it's also brought with it new challenges of how to be as inclusive and as accessible as possible working in this virtual digital space.
And what's one of the things that I love most about virtual working is the potential for the audience that you can reach. And I think about myself, and I think if I was going into an office in Belfast every day and just working in that office, and I wasn't working virtually, and I wasn't able to connect, I wasn't able to use platforms like LinkedIn or webinars, whatever I'm doing, I'd be so limited to the audience and to what I was able to do. And I think that if there's been any kind of, I'm not going to say benefit, because it's not a benefit. I think if there's been any learning, any real learning from the pandemic, it has been that everything should be opened up to virtual. And I think of it this way as well, especially from an accessibility point of view. Accessibility to me is being able to provide something in alternative ways and in different formats. This is what the pandemic has allowed us to do. And for somebody like me, working from home, I'm able to use my adjustments. Same as any educators or students out there, we're able to use our adjustments. We're able to do it in a way that we're confident. We don't have to worry about anybody else touching it, because it's nothing worse than somebody coming in and adjusting your settings and you've spent ages trying to do it. So it's that comfort. But one thing I do want to touch on, because I feel we were going to be completely remiss if we don't talk about, is your book, Hannah, because you have a book out in the market which is available on Amazon. Done. And if you haven't got that, by the way, you can get this on Amazon. But do you want to tell us where did this motivation for the book come from?
It's quite a beast. It's quite a big book. The idea.
You're almost to your 1 point stop shop.
So the point of the book, to go back to the fact that we were conceived virtually, grassroots. We have to remember that only 10% of educators are on Twitter, as an example. So in some ways, we've built up a lot of momentum and a lot of traction, but only in that echo chamber that is a social media platform. So myself and Benny, so Benny was the deputy head I mentioned, who was the reason why we started Diverse Ed in the first place. We had a conversation about the fact that how could we take the conversation from social media to a more academic, theoretical, like how can we influence the system? Because not everyone's on social media and not everyone's part of the conversation there. So we came up with the idea of doing a book. And because I'd spent that year working at the university, there was a university publishing company where one of the alumni, also an English graduate, and I had met, and he'd said to me, if you ever want to do a book, get in touch. So we had this idea of this book. I contacted Tom, they agreed to publish it, and we were very grateful that an academic press was interested in publishing the book. We then went out to our network, and we had a very clear structure in our head that we wanted the book to have this balance and this equity across all 9 of the protected characteristics outlined in the Equality Act of 2010, with a 10th chapter on intersectionality. So we had this kind of like this matrix of, we wanted 10 sections, we wanted a chapter editor with lived experience for each of the chapters, and a team of 10 people that represented lived experience of that chapter, but also had intersectional lenses on how to talk about marriage, civil partnership, or religion and belief. So it was quite a design process because we had hundreds of people who wanted to contribute to the book, but we could have done 100 people talking about race because race was so much in the spotlight at that time. We really found it hard to find people to talk about disability. We found it really hard to find people to talk about religion and belief. So we kept going out to our network and creating this balance. So we did upset quite a few people by saying, unfortunately, on this occasion, you're not going to be in the book. We're full in this chapter, unless you can write for one of these chapters. And then we had about a 9-month lead in where Benny and I worked with the chapter editors. They worked with their contributor teams. And we had, in theory, 112 of us, but then we had co-editors and co-authors. It ended up being about 123 people, I think, in total. I was herding cats, JB. I was herding cats. Like, I'm pretty efficient on the old email and Outlook calendars and deadlines and things like that. But it was a really interesting process trying to bring so many people together. And Benny and I created this loose structure where each chapter is structured in a similar way, but we wanted each person to have their own authentic voice and their own style of talking. So they had to academically reference it, but we didn't then say what language they needed to use. So it was a learning journey. It was published in April this year, and we've had really good feedback on it because it is a book you can dip in and out of. Like, you don't need to read it in a linear way. So when we're doing training with schools and they've got work to be done, for example, around gender identity expression and trans awareness, they can go to that chapter and read those 10 bits. If an individual person's got an area of interest, they can dip in and out of it. So yeah, we're very proud of bringing all those people together and giving a platform, I guess, for all of those voices to coexist in one space.
Do you know, I was sitting looking around me trying to find your copy because I got the copy when we had we were initially talking, and I'm trying to find my copy. But I think the thing that I like most about it is you get books within the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they're always so specific. So it'll be disability, A to Z disability, A to Z racism. You go through. There's all these different books, but it was never really nothing that was. And I know it's not an encyclopedia, but I think anything for me that gives me that information where I can use, pull information, it's like what one-stop shop. Anything I can go in and stick my own post-its on top of too is just an absolute asset. And I think that the fact that you also wrap up nicely with the intersectional piece at the end is something that is so missing. I think it's where we evolve this line of work in 2023 is, we were brought to attention, and the world had to come to attention with the murder of George Floyd. We had to take action, and I think the past few years we have been taking that action, but I think it needs to evolve now into that intersectional piece. And I think that the more resources that we have, the more work that we can do with educators, with students, with workplaces, with everybody in society to realise that, you know what, this is only one piece of our identity. We're made up of all these different things, and if we're creating accessibility, there's less likelihood of us having to constantly disclose and disclose and disclose and disclose. Whereas when we're not having to disclose because of accessibility, and we can actually be our authentic selves, you've created something fully accessible that we can engage, participate in. The benefit of that, as opposed to having to disclose, it's just so much more organic. It's so much more impactful, and I think it's so much more important for the individual.
I completely agree. And taking action really resonates because I think some books are really theoretical and you can't see how to apply them. Some books are really practical, but it's almost like we're sharing stories and people don't know how to then make those human stories and that lived experience work within a context. So we did have that really clear perspective that we wanted there to be a blend of both, some theory, some storytelling, but some practice. And the 3 questions for the reader after each chapter and the 3 things to go and think about in your school context were really important to us. And we're really grateful that a number of universities have now put it on the reading list for their teacher training pathway, for their leadership pathway, because it's really lacking. Going back to education and how teachers are trained and how leaders are trained, DEI is not in the frameworks, any of the new frameworks that have evolved over the last few years, and we think it should be. So if we can penetrate that reading space and at least get it on there as a recommended text, then that's a starting point as well.
Well, we will make sure that we put a link for the book in the comments. So I think, and this is something I want to make very clear to readers, it doesn't matter if you're working within education space, whether you are an educator, whether you're a youth worker, whether you're somebody working within an organisation, apart anybody, this book can benefit everybody because it's got that element of the lived experience. I tell everybody, there's no experience like lived experience, and being able to get that understanding through that lens and then have the kind of the education piece behind it to back it up, I just think it's beautiful. It's a beautiful book, Hannah, and you and your colleagues and everyone involved should be just honestly. I'll have to get you signed my copy one day now. Actually, I've come in my head. Um, when we meet in person, we'll do it in live event night. But I'm conscious of the time because we've been rambling away and I think we've got about 8 minutes left, 7 minutes left. And what I want to do is before we kind of do our final moment, which is spill the tea, where we'll spill a moment uh, on something that's not been very inclusive, maybe something that's not been very accessible, maybe something that's made you go, nope, not today, or has grinded your gears for a better expression. But before I do that there, I want to talk about your goals for 2023. Since we're in 2023, we made it. It is a new year, new beginnings and all that. What is your goals for first for yourself personally and then for diverse ed?
Okay, great questions. Goals for me. I'm moving house in the spring, so I moved up to Oxfordshire to be a head teacher. I don't necessarily need to be here anymore, so I'm relocating. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited about that new chapter, which will be happening in the spring. And I'll be closer to home. So my family are from the West Country, and I'm going to be moving to Bath, so I'll be a bit closer. Goals for diverse educators. So it's our 5th birthday in January, and we're going to be marking that. And you have to kind of pinch yourself about how much you've done in those 5 years and where we started and where we are now. We couldn't have conceived that really, and having the book and everything else. One of the things I'm doing is growing the team because we're kind of at capacity. So at the moment, there's 5-6 of us who do the training. But I'm picking up some brilliant associates who are going to be joining the team in the new year with different specialisms around trans identities, neurodiversity, the curriculum, anti-racism. So that's really exciting to think about how we keep growing those connections and those collaborations to be as useful as possible for the system. And then we were face-to-face events and we became virtual events, and all the benefits of now being virtual, how we get that balance of doing some face-to-face stuff, because I think people are craving some face-to-face training, face-to-face events, but you then do put barriers in for people not being able to access those events. So I think that's what I'm still trying to work out, how many of our opportunities will be virtual and how many opportunities we have which will be in person to kind of suit the needs of the community as best as possible.
I can see in the future for yourself, Hannah, a global conference of people in person, down and online with thousands and thousands of people. I genuinely do, and I hope that if there's anybody out there who is interested in Hannah's work and the work of diverse ed, please do reach out because honestly, the conversations you get with Hannah they're always fun, but they're just invaluable. And I think that one thing I appreciate with you, Hannah, is you have such an incredible network. And I know that if you didn't know the answer, you would have that passed on to somebody else. You will have that connection. So let's have a look at our uninclusive moments. So Hannah, before we start to wrap up, I want to ask you, has there been a moment recently that has grinded your gears, a moment that has not been so uninclusive?
There's been a few, JB, so I'm not sure which one's the most pertinent to share. I think, I know we're talking about accessibility and inclusion, disability in particular, but I think something that's really jarring at the moment is how Meghan Markle's been treated, and how our national media are just gunning for a woman of colour. And the whole Jeremy Clarkson thing that's happened this weekend has been really upsetting. And to see how that traction's built and this man with this platform is using it to spew hate at someone. So I think that to me really says to me how important this work is, that people are being given license to behave like that and talk like that. So that's one, I guess, on a kind of a national level. An ongoing thing that jars me is the fact that a lot of events aren't equitable when it comes to what they pay their speakers. So whenever I get asked to speak at an event, I firstly challenge them on their lack of representation and help them diversify their lineup. But then my next layer of challenge is, are they paying everyone equally? And I just don't understand how event organisers do not build that into their design process of an event, that people get asked to give their fee and they're quite happy paying the white, straight, able-bodied man XXX amount of money, and then anyone else gets a different kind of rate. So that's my ongoing bugbear, to really make sure that if we are consciously including and representing and making events accessible and diverse and representative, we need to make sure there's equity built into the event as well.
100%. And I think I'll cover the second point. I want to add to what you said to the second point because, see, for me, as a disabled person who fell into the space of speaking, I've done a lot of paid speaking gigs, and one of the things I always struggle with is how do you place a value on your lived experience, and to do so is so difficult. And I think one thing that organisations and organise event sponsors or event creators, whatever your position is, there is to create that equitable and equitable pay scale because we could be underpaying ourselves because we just don't understand or we don't know what our value is. Whereas when you're paid or preference and somebody paying thousands for one speaker and paying £100 another, there's something not right there. So it's not because you still should be getting each of your speakers should be contributing to the conversation. And if they're not, you need to evaluate either who your speaker panel is or that representation.
And can I add something there? Because I do a lot of coaching, and I coach a lot of people from marginalised identities and backgrounds who feel quite uncomfortable asking for more money. And I work with them. So if you're listening to this and you're someone who's doing the work, you're speaking at events, you want to be doing the work, just create yourself a rates card and compare it to other people. Where literally, when someone says to you, Jamie, can you come and speak at my event? Sure, attached is my rates card, my keynote fee, my workshop fee, my whole day fee, my half day fee, my virtual fee, my face to face fee. Make it as black and white as possible, but make sure that you say you're not underselling yourself and it's comparative to other people in your field. That perhaps makes the negotiation easier as opposed to them saying how much you'd like us to pay and you underselling yourself and feeling humble and modest, but then kicking yourself when you find out the person next to you is being paid 4 or 5 times what you've asked for.
And I read something today about speaker fees, and I'm not going to use the exact language because I said a bad word, but it said something along the words of essentially, if you're not sweating it out after you've sent your rates card across, then you've undervalued yourself. And I kind of thought about it, I was like, well, I don't know if that's a good thing. And I've realised, actually, do you know what? Yeah, because I remember when I was paying my first, I'm not going to say how much I charged. If you want to know, email me. But when I was after the gig and I sent them my first rates card, and I was going, they're not going to pay that. They're not going to pay that. I think I'm crazy. What have I done here? And they came back and said, yep, no problem. When do you want to, here was the invoice. And I can remember thinking, oh, somebody's going to pay me for my time rather than asking for free advice. But I went off tangent there, but I do want to add also what you said about Meghan Markle, because I think I would be remiss as a male if I didn't say something, because it's disgusting. It's absolutely vile. It's disgusting. And I think of two things. One, I think of the behaviour of the social media. Do you remember Caroline Flack? What happened to Caroline Flack a few years ago? They bullied that woman in until she took her own life, and it was absolutely horrendous. They bullied her, and I'm watching the same patterns happen. But there's such an element of race to it. There's such an element of, now I'm going to be terrible saying this word because I always struggle with it, but it's so I can't say this word. Misogynistic. There we go. I struggle with that. There's too many Y's and G's in there for me. But it's so misogynistic, and I sit back and I think, where could we wrap up in 2022? The murder of George Floyd is a few years ago. Have we learned nothing about working to be a more inclusive society? And I look at the people who's making these comments, and I think, these are the people who is holding us back, and we are giving them a platform. Why are we not giving platforms to people like yourself, people who are going to uplift and amplify these messages?
I love the fact that Jamie Clarkson's daughter has gone public
Yes.
and called them out.
Right,
like that's our next generation, isn't it? That the young people on the whole get this. They need this work. They've got the language. They've got the understanding, and the intergenerational divide is going to get bigger if we don't re-educate the people who have got the platform and they're misusing it. So well done to Jamie Clarkson's daughter for taking them on publicly and telling him that what he's saying is completely inappropriate.
100%. And I'm conscious now because we are at time, but Hannah, I just want to say this has been absolutely incredible. You are such an amazing person. Whenever we speak, I get excited. I feel more passionate and I want to take on the world. But for anybody who wants to reach out to you, where's the best way to do so?
I would just go to our website. So our website is www.diverseeducators.co.uk. And on there, you've got all of our links to our different platforms. So our Twitter handle, our LinkedIn, our Facebook, our Instagram, our Mighty Network, which is our virtual community space, our newsletter, our Eventbrite. We exist on most social media platforms, but the website's probably the best place to start. And like you said, yes, we are for education, but a lot of the work we do and a lot of the resources we curate are applicable to other sectors as well. So please do feel free to find them, use them, share them.
The resources are intersectional across different spaces, so do tap into them. Hannah, incredible. And also, by the way, guests, check out my website. There is a link to go onto Hannah's website too, which will be coming. So do check that out. But Hannah, thank you so much for spilling the tea on the inclusivity as I cheers you with my mug.
Thank you for having me, Jamie. It's great to be here.
Anytime at all. Everybody, Happy New Year, and we look forward to catching you on the next episode. Bye!